Howdy, y'all. Welcome back to the channel. When the PACT Act passed on August 10th, 2022, most of us just reflected on that we're veterans in wartime theaters. We reflected on how, all these things are now presumptives that weren't before. What a presumptive is it's basically the VA saying, here's your nexus, here's your connections. If you just prove to us you served in a wartime theater and you have any of these medical conditions that we deem have associations with your toxic exposures from those wartime theaters, be it Republic of Vietnam and Agent Orange and all those other countries that relate to Agent Orange, or you are in the Middle East or any of these other areas where we've deemed there were toxic exposures, burn pits, particulate matter, we are now going to presume that those exposures caused it. So just give us your medical evidence, file your claims, but the examiners are just going to rubber stamp it if they see you have the condition because it's presumptive. No medical opinion needed. A lot of veterans that didn't serve in wartime theaters didn't fully understand this at first, but that law also allowed veterans who didn't serve in wartime theaters, now hear me if this is you, to file for claims based on a potential association with toxic exposure. And I'm going to tell you how that works in terms of how we're told to make TERA memorandums in your file. This is huge. So if you file a claim and you're saying, I felt I was in the Navy, I was exposed to asbestos, my duties and tasks that I had related to this MOS show that I was exposed to jet fuels or just fuels and solvents and cleaning supplies and lead paint and all such things. And you can go to the VA exposure website and just look at what they say military soldiers could have been exposed to. And there's also, a lot of you may not know this who were in the Navy that served back in the day, there's a whole M21 regulation that tells us that if a veteran has these MOSs and they were in the Navy, there's either a high, low, or moderate probability of asbestos. So when you explicitly claim, and you should, in a statement or related to on your 526 or on your 0995, you file for a claim, you need to associate with toxic exposure and list those exposures in a lay statement or on the 526, lead, jet fuels, PFAS if you were in the Air Force and you had any, or in the Navy and you ever fought fires, or you had fire watch, also called AFFS. But if you show us that, we were previously prohibited from forming what we call an internal memo in your file that is called a TERA memorandum based on just MOS alone. But what they've clarified, especially over this last year, is if your duties that were related to your MOS correspond with those exposures, we should give you a TERA memorandum. Now, let me tell you internally what that tells the medical examiners that you don't see. The medical VA contract examiners see that we've made or not conceded TERA based on specific things. They then begin to search for whether or not they can provide a rationale that gives you that connection on the basis of the toxic exposure. Let's say you list 10 toxic exposures and you've put in a statement how those do correspond to the duties and tasks you had in your MOS. You can't just say my MOS was I was in the Air Force or I was in the Navy and I was exposed to jet fuels. Be specific. Go to that website for different medical exposures that's on the va.gov website and look up all those military exposures and list them all out. Put them in a statement. Try to remember as much as you can. And then that's going to force the claims rater to have to make a decision on your claim. If we were going to deny, let's say, we would have to examine, do they have a TERA? Now, often if we're going to grant on other basis, presumptive or direct or secondary or aggravated, we won't even make a TERA memo. It's like it doesn't exist because we don't have to. But if we're going to deny on those bases, before we can make our final submit, we have to weigh whether or not your TERA is conceded or not conceded. And honestly, different raters are changing decisions from previous raters who might have been too liberal to base it only on MOS. So if you said it was based on my MOS and you got a previous TERA memo, one of your other decisions you get later may say TERA is no longer conceded. Well, the reason for that is you didn't give specifics related to your duties and tasks. But now the gate seems to be wide open for veterans to say, here's the duty and tasks of my MOS. And if you have more than one on your DD 214, list all the exposures. And if you were in the Navy, go to the M21, Google it online. What probability is it that my job and my role in the Navy had a probability of asbestos? Almost everybody in the Navy that served under any, I don't know, you don't call it MOS, but we do. But under that job rating is going to have a probability judgment for whether it's low, moderate, or high. So I'm talking a mile a minute, but let me get this out. So you file your claim, you say it's associated with certain toxic exposures. You've listed out, here were my duties based on my MOS. Here's the things I did in service. Here's the exposures. And you went to the VA website to kind of bolster all those comments that you made. When that comes into the VA, they must generally, if there was no other reason to connect you with a claim. Now, again, you got to have a current medical condition. So give them some evidence of that, or a lot of lay symptoms if you don't have a diagnosis. But that should get you an exam. And at the exam, your medical examiner, your VA contract examiners, man, I am seeing some of the wildest conjectures and associations based on asbestos and lead. I'm having to kick some of those back to remind the VA examiners that the burden of proof, and I've talked about this before, it's low and it's in our favor, but there is a burden of proof. It's called at least as likely. That means the evidence for and against has to be at least equal for them to find for you. If that evidence is far less, so for example, let's say you have coronary artery disease and you were in the Navy and you were exposed to asbestos, and your job in the M21, it says you had a high probability of asbestos exposure, but you serve 2 years, 5 years, 6 years, whatever. So when that comes to the examiner, they're making a decision. Let's say these nurse practitioners or these PAs, often they're not doctors with a VA contract. They're looking at, okay, they've got maybe a list of studies that show potential causal links between asbestos and coronary artery disease. Well, what I'm finding often is happening is those medical contract examiners, and especially those private doctors who get paid to make those decisions for you, are attempting to convince the VA that they have reached their burden of proof of an at least as likely medical rationale to support a link between your coronary artery disease and, let's say, that study that showed there was a potential connection. Here's the problem. You go to that study and you see, what does that study show? And what I often find is they're just the most potential links within the realm of medical possibility. And that's not the standard. The standard is there needs to be equal evidence for and against. So let's say you've got a lot of health risks that may have related to why you developed coronary artery disease. Maybe you smoked for 40 years, cigarettes, and then you quit because you realized it was killing you. And you're overweight, and you've got all these risk factors that genetics, your father had a heart attack in his 50s. So you've got all these factors that the medical professional has to weigh as the causal link for your coronary artery disease, but they see you served in the military and they see you had a high probability of asbestos, and asbestos does have a link to potential heart conditions. So they're the ones that are supposed to be weighing medically for us. Does it meet the at least as likely standard? Is the evidence equally balanced? Half will say, no, that's not enough for me to make a decision that the evidence is equally for you and against you. The evidence is far less causal. It's just a potential link. Whereas others who have more of an advocate's heart will say, want to get you in the door with claims. And they're saying yes to migraines based on that. Yes to heart condition. And now there are certain conditions that don't even allow you to file for TERA. And there's what we call a TERA exception job aid. You can actually I wonder if you can find this by Googling TERA exception job aid, but it says there are certain conditions that the VA has presumed based on enough study that there is no connection with Agent Orange, or there is no connection between toxic exposures and these conditions. And those include conditions like musculoskeletal and mental disorders. So often on a denial, you'll see we considered whether or not this related to your toxic exposure that we conceded, but the Secretary of the VA has determined there's no association between ABC mental disorder and the toxic exposure, or ABC musculoskeletal conditions, or toxic exposure. So you're not going to get a TERA for that based on the current rules and regulations, unless somebody doesn't know what they're doing with their job. But if it's not a musculoskeletal, let's say it's respiratory or heart or organ related or a cancer or stroke, or hypertension, those can be terror related. And often, if it's, again, the medical professionals are trying to give us their best judgment, and they're trying to quickly learn and gain expertise by gathering, I think, enough studies that support their rationales to find for you. So as they do that, more claims are going to come in that are going to be granted. So if you're the veteran, you're going to benefit from that. You are. So if you want to file your claims and go for it, go for it. And also, just a word to the wise, there are secondary conditions that are the VA is much more favorable to finding than they used to. I've talked about this before. Those of you that have PTSD diagnoses, and you also have sleep apnea, as many of you know, sleep apnea with CPAP is a 50% rating. That's a pretty plumpy rating. So, and it's very hard to get sleep apnea if it wasn't shown in service. So for those of you that have other conditions that contribute to sleep apnea, asthma can contribute. Of course, it gets bound together sometime into one rating, but let's say you get connected for asthma and it's only like a 10% because your PFTs aren't terrible, but sleep apnea is 50%. When we combine those together in your decision, your actual full decision is asthma to include sleep apnea at 50%. So those are worth going for. Secondary connections with apnea are a big one to go for. And like I said, half the examiners say there's no link between PTSD and sleep apnea. It has to do with obesity or overweight and the size of your neck and blah, 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 other factors. And half of the others say there is a connection, and they cite some studies. So go out there and do your research if you're trying to make secondary connections, and do a good job at it. And for those of you that are not filed for TERA, those of you that served, especially in the mid to late 80s, that didn't serve in harm's way before the Gulf War, and between Vietnam and Gulf War, think about your toxic exposures really strongly. Do some research. If you need to file appeals based on TERA, now do it based on that knowledge, and good luck to you. So I hope that helped. I think that was the most secret sauce I've given in a while. TERA is a big one. And till next time, y'all take care.